I am Nicole Porter, Senior Director of Advocacy for the Sentencing Project, a research and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., which advocates for an effective and humane response to crime that minimizes imprisonment and criminalization of youth and adults by promoting racial, ethnic, economic, and gender justice, guaranteeing voting rights for all, including persons completing their sentence inside and outside of prisons and jails, regardless of their crime of conviction, is a strategic priority for the Sentencing Project that will continue to guide our work now that this year's election cycle is over. Today, we are hosting a virtual discussion on Locked Out, the 2022 midterms and felony disenfranchisement. Let me provide an overview of our conversation this afternoon. I am going to introduce our panelists, and we are going to start with an overview of the recent report that the Sentencing Project published in late October, co-authored by Chris Uggen, who's on with us today, and a top-notch research team that joined him in publishing updated estimates of people denied voting rights with criminal conviction histories. On the other side of Chris's comments, we will have a conversation with our panelists and leave room for discussion and Q&A before we wrap up at the top of the hour. So please share comments in the Q&A function in the chat, questions and comments in the Q&A function in the chat, because about halfway through this discussion, we're going to turn to the comments and questions from you in the audience and bring that into the dialogue that I and the panelists will be having this afternoon. So let me introduce the panelists, and then on the other side of my introduction, we'll turn to Chris, who will give an overview of the recent report. So Chris Uggen is a Regents Professor, Martindale Chair, and Distinguished McKnight Professor in Sociology, Law, and Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. He studies crime, law, and inequality from a life course perspective, with a firm belief that sound research can help build a more just and peaceful world. Stephanie Jeffcoat is the All of Us or None organizer with California's A New Way of Life Community Reentry Project. California expanded voting rights to tens of thousands of people in 2020 with overwhelming support via ballot measure. Proposition 17 restored voting rights to persons in the community on parole. Jorge Renaud is also joining us this afternoon. Jorge is the National Criminal Justice Director for LatinoJustice. Jorge survived over 27 years imprisonment and is now a national leader guiding criminal legal reforms in Texas and across the country. Jorge has been an integral part of Re-envision Justicia's network of Latinx organizers, lawyers, and policy analysts for years, and a regular and popular speaker at LatinoJustice annual convenings of Latinx and the criminal justice system. Leigh Owens is joining us from the Mid-Atlantic, the East Coast. He is the Executive Director of Pennsylvania's PENNfranchise, a Philadelphia native. Leigh has been an organizer and communications professional for over 15 years. While a student at Drexel University, Leigh was forced out of college to spend a year on Rikers Island and was ultimately stained with the felony conviction that had a negative impact on his early attempts at seeking employment and a career path until he found organizing. And then last but not least, we are joined by Neil Volz, the Deputy Director for the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition, who has more than 25 years of experience working as a public servant and community advocate. Neil is currently the Deputy Director for the Florida Rights Restoration Coalition and has helped, along with Desmond Meade, anchoring Florida's Amendment 4 and working on implementing and guaranteeing voting rights for those in Florida. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. We're going to have a really important conversation coming off of last week's midterm election, and not just debrief the election, but also talk about what comes next for the movement. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Chris. I'm looking forward to your comments.
Thank you, Nicole. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you all in attendance for your important work on this issue. I'm going to be very brief, but please reach out if I can be of assistance to you. The report is a team effort with Ryan Larson of Hamline University, kind of our chief number cruncher. Sarah Shannon of the University of Georgia helps with the law and southern states, and Rob Stewart of the University of Maryland joined us this year in writing our voting while ineligible section. We couldn't imagine having better partners than Nicole Porter and our friends at the Sentencing Project. They're the best reviewers we could ask for on this, as well as partners. I've been studying voting restrictions for people with criminal convictions for over 20 years, and a few things really stood out this year. We estimate about 4.6 million were disenfranchised, as Nicole mentioned, in the United States. This is a decline, though, since about 2016, when there were 6.1 million. So that means that about 1.5 million more people were eligible in this election that we just concluded than would have been eligible just a few years before. Now, how'd that happen? Well, the big thing, there's been big legal and policy changes, as many of you know, and many of you have worked so hard for, that have expanded the right to vote in many states, 8 since 2020. So, if we count California, Connecticut, Iowa, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Virginia, Washington. Now, by my calculations, this is the most intense period of change since 1850 on this issue. Didn't know that until this weekend, Nicole. That's why I'm just presenting it today. I'd say right now, the modal restriction is now prison only. That means people are disenfranchised for their period of incarceration. This still means a ton of people are disenfranchised, but just a few years ago, the modal restriction was everyone under supervision: prison, probation, parole, etc. Still, if you add it all up in at 4.6 million, about half are post-sentence. So, and that's just in those 11 states that still have post-sentence restrictions. Those numbers just accumulate and accumulate and accumulate. And only about 24% are currently incarcerated. So we've also seen, in addition to the legal change, we've also seen some decrease in populations in the criminal legal system. Some of this is tied to the pandemic, and others to trends that started cooling a bit around 2008. Now, it's gotten much harder to estimate these 50 state regimes here. So we present our estimates with some humility. That is that figuring out eligibility, for example, in many states, as you know, is very complex in individual situations. We try to present an account that we can right down the middle, as clear as we can understand it. And we tried our best to handle this uncertainty in the report, but we rely on local information. And of course, we can't advise on individual situations, which can be quite complex given the legal changes. The pandemic brought a lot of uncertainty too, and affected our methodology. We were a little more cautious in extrapolating any numbers over the last couple of years because the populations were so disrupted. And I can talk about that if folks are interested. I did want to mention the terrible racial disparities that remain. Disenfranchisement is clearly a civil rights issue. Black disenfranchisement is now 5.3% of the adult population. That's the total adult voting age population by our estimates overall. Now this is versus, so 5.3% for Black citizens, 1.5% for non-Black. And so you can see the disparities, and about 2% overall of the electorate is disenfranchised. This is much higher in many states, of course, particularly in the Southeast. But this number was 8% as recently as 2004. So these disparities are huge, but they are declining too slowly. So I mentioned there were these waves of waves of reenfranchisement in the last couple of years. The last big wave of reenfranchisement was in the 1960s and 1970s, during the kind of peak of the civil rights movement. The earlier waves of disenfranchisement, of course, were 100 years earlier in the post-Civil War and Reconstruction era, and then throughout Jim Crow. So 1860s and 1870s is when we saw a lot of the restrictions placed onto the books. Now, I mentioned we also added a short section on voting while ineligible. We think this is a key issue going forward in coming years. As many of you probably shared the experience that I had, seeing it's gut-wrenching video footage of citizens who've been law-abiding for many years being cuffed and arrested in Florida, but also elsewhere in Tennessee and Texas and in Minnesota and many other states. We looked at 400 Minnesota cases over the last 13 years, and we looked at who would be caught up in kind of this if everyone were prosecuted for voting while ineligible just by matching databases. And it was disproportionately Black, disproportionately female, and about half of the folks who were prosecuted in Minnesota in recent years were only convicted of what we consider poverty crimes, things like receiving receiving illegal receipt of benefits or minor theft. The impact, of course, as I opened with, can be consequential, the political impact. The number disenfranchised often exceeds, as you looked at those vote returns and watched those maps on Tuesday night, or really probably through the last couple of days, the number disenfranchised often exceeds the vote margins in key elections like the US Senate. So I'm going to conclude, it's really the tale of two trends here. One, there's the disenfranchisement laws are receding. Some states are extending the ballot, yet illegal voting prosecutions, intimidation, and suppression seem to be on the rise. Fewer are formally disenfranchised, but more may be intimidated. So it's still an uphill battle, as you all know. And in the long arc of disenfranchisement since the Civil War and Reconstruction, the progress is clear. And there's been more action now than ever before. Every state is different, but from my perspective, the door barring access to voting is barely hanging on its hinges. So thank you for your attention and for your important work on this issue, and I'll look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Chris. And your framing really sets us up perfectly to get into this dialogue. So thank you for that. And thank you always for your thoughtful research and analysis, as well to you and your research partners on the team that helped guide the report. So thank you. But let's get into this discussion. We have, over 160 people in the audience this afternoon and more people who are interested in the discussion. So I just want to open it up and ask Stephanie, Jorge, Leigh, and Neil for their reactions to Chris's comments. And we'll start with you, Stephanie.
Ladies first, I guess. Thank you, Chris. Thank you for all of your work on this. I love to hear the data and the numbers around it. And I would like to think that the reason that these numbers have declined and more people now are eligible to vote is because of the work that we have done in all of our states. This work is so important. I feel it's never going to be done, and we're going to continue until we are able to restore the voting rights for everyone. But just hearing, the report and thinking back to slavery days, this is something that has been an issue in our country since the birth of our nation. It's not something that just started, we've been dealing with this for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I think it's just even more important why we continue to advocate to restore voting rights to all. Voting, being a part of vote, having the ability to vote is part of democracy, and giving people that power and to use their voice is so crucial.
Thank you, Stephanie. Very important. Jorge?
It always takes a minute to unmute. Yeah, thanks a lot, Chris. I've always been astounded by some of the work coming out of the University of Minnesota. A good shout out to folks at the Rubin Institute there. Folks here are at all interested in parole research. They are the best in the country. They do some incredible stuff there. I think my reaction to his report is one, of course, some optimism, right? Because of the downward arc of the total numbers. And I think that I maybe tie that into, and again, cautiously optimistic here, to the fact that folks in Vermont, Oregon, Tennessee, and Alabama took the other word slavery out of the state constitutions. I think there's a growing trend, and thanks a lot to the National Association, to the Abolished Slavery National Network for leading those fights on the state level. There's a willingness, I think, for folks on the state level to look at issues of folks who are incarcerated. And Alabama, I'm not denigrating anybody here from Alabama, but if we can do it in Alabama, we can almost do that anywhere. Yeah, Colorado and Nebraska had already done that. I will say that the way you prefaced and led this argument and us into this discussion, Nicole, about the regardless of crime of conviction, I think that's a trend, and that's something that I see that maybe we need to find a way around those arguments, right? And not settle for the don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and find a way to maybe bring some organizations that are based on the experience of survivors to counteract, right, the argument that, oh, those people kill somebody and that they should not be ever giving any rights, that those people committed some sexually related crimes, and find a way around those arguments in a way to continue to humanize those individuals. I think that's something that we need to do, and I think we'll talk about that more in the implementation.
Thank you. And Leigh, any reactions to Chris's opening comments?
Absolutely. I mean, I certainly agree with everything I've heard so far. Some refreshing comments here. Grateful that we're all on the same page, it seems like, and being able to sort of, note separate sides of the coin that we all, have to, play different roles in this fight. But first of all, Chris, thank you for this data. It's really helpful. It's really helpful to know that we're at least moving in the right direction. I will say in Pennsylvania, I saw this year, literally starting in like January or February, the kind of excitement and engagement around the electorate in jails, in county jails, that I haven't seen in a while. And a lot of that work had to do with the formerly incarcerated community on the ground of Pennsylvania, going back into the jails to have the conversations about how being involved in the electorate really changed people's lives who were formerly incarcerated, to the extent that a lot of us looked at being involved in the electorate as sort of a gateway into advocacy and, advocating for the issues and the circumstances that lead to incarceration, right? And realizing that a lot of those issues have to deal with the people that we elect into our offices, whether it's judge, district attorney, and whatever, right? And so we saw that this year, but we also saw barriers to that within some of the jails with the people that were eligible to vote. Some of the barriers that existed since COVID, whether it be like the lack of paper mail, for example, right, or the lack of visitation policies to do voter registration. But despite a lot of those barriers, I know one of our coalitions was able, collectively to register about 400 people in Pennsylvania. And I mean, if you look at some of the election results that are still coming in, some of these elections they're like coming down to 5 or 10 votes, right? And so being able to show our community how important it is for them to cast their vote, right, is going to create the kind of incentive within the formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated communities, right, to lead that fight to make it so folks that are serving felony convictions in state prisons, that we can expand the franchise to them as well. So again, I think we're moving in a very positive direction based on that data, because it does sort of reinforce what I've personally seen on the ground this year with the outreach and engagement with the formerly incarcerated community. So I think if we continue on this trajectory, if we continue to do outreach to people that are currently incarcerated, if we bridge the gap between the currently and the formerly incarcerated people, and continue, to do outreach and continue to have conversations with these populations, and then not forgetting the family and friends of currently and formerly incarcerated people, which is a whole nother voting block that I know we're not necessarily discussing, but I think that it's really important to really connect the dots on how the criminal legal system in America has really crippled the voting franchise amongst people of color, particularly Black and brown people, and not just the people that have and are serving time, but again, their family and friends, some of which have never seen the inside of a jail, but some of which don't participate for the same reasons in which we find ourselves incarcerated so often, right? So, you know, addressing those issues and making a case, right, to address the systemic issues in our communities, we saw this year is what it's going to take to create the kind of excitement and engagement around the electorate, to be able to have the kind of political power to expand it to folks that are doing state time felony convictions.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Leigh. And that really, I think, is a great natural transition to Neil. So Neil, want to bring you into the conversation to get your reactions to Chris's opening comments, and then anything else you want to share.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Nicole, and thank you, Chris, and everybody who worked on that report. It kind of, you know, as somebody who lost my voting rights in 2006 when I got my felony conviction, and then I was listening to the report and thinking about what a wonderful experience it was personally to be able to vote in Florida in 2020, and how it just kind of made me feel like a part of my community and like a full citizen in my society, and that warmed my heart thinking about all the people who have had that experience in recent years, but also just a reminder of the long-term work that we continue to have to live up to the promise of seeing everybody be able to have that participation in their community and in the way that I did just in the last couple years. I also think that what's really stuck out to me, and I was listening to Stephanie talk about this and thinking about the success in California with Dorsey and Steph, with your organization. I look at Tara up and many other folks that get in trouble. We start mentioning names. We go to Washington State, right? You see stuff in Louisiana, right? And North Carolina with the advances that we've seen with the work that our organization and the movement down in Florida has done. I think there's something really special, and it's one of the kind of the biggest stories that a lot of people, one, don't believe, but also don't even see sometimes. And that's not even about the what is going on, but how it's happened. In all these cases, the movement to expand democracy is actually being led by people who had lost their vote, right? Like in some ways, there's not a better evangelist in this moment for democracy than somebody who lost the right to vote and got it back. Because all around us, we see a broken communication system, political system. You know, we're almost incapable of talking about these incredibly sacred democracy topics, and yet here we are in this setting, looking at leaders and people who have actually moved the ball forward in a positive way. And in so many instances, it's being led by people whose past experiences to other folks in society would suggest that they're not the right leaders. But I would say to you, Nicole, to Sentencing Project, to bringing folks together, there's some sort of secret sauce here that I think would actually benefit all of society. And it doesn't just have to be in compartments of places where people who have been impacted are having conversations, but that there is something about starting a conversation about basic human dignity and that belief underneath all of us, no matter where we come from, that when a debt's paid, it's paid, and that you shouldn't be losing your rights in the first place. I think those things are not just things we need to convince people of, but that actually exist within all of us as human beings.
Thank you so much, Neil. What a great way to round out that first round of questions. I want to remind folks in the audience to, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A portion of the chat. And then in about 10 minutes, we're going to come to the Q&A and start lifting up questions that you all have asked there. I think, Neil, your comments set up what we all know, right? It's why we organized this conversation in the way that we did, that there is an active movement that has expanded voting rights. And in many ways, Chris's opening comments touched on that, given the expansion of rights. And I forget exactly the words you used to frame it, Chris, but essentially the fact that disenfranchisement is being reduced, right? Although there are still millions of people who were not able to vote last week. So I think there's this question about the expansion of rights, but then there's also this challenge of implementation. And I wanted us to touch on that this afternoon. So once rights have been gained, what are challenges, what are best practices from you all's experience in terms of actually guaranteeing ballot access for newly eligible voters? This is obviously top of the conversation, given the two realities that Chris also centered in his comments. This one duality being around the expansion of rights, but another issue being around the criminalization, and that could result in the chilling of voter participation. So I want to start with Jorge, and then I'll call on folks to go next. But Jorge.
Yeah, thanks. I want to focus on a couple of things that Neil said. And first is, I totally agree with him that I will get to vote in 2051, brother. So, I get that feeling that you talked about, right? That feeling of being part of society. And I think that's the biggest piece when it comes to restoring the right to vote to individuals who from whom that has been taken away. The actual outcome of the election is one thing. But that feeling that you get of, I am accepted, I am part of society, I have gone through this ritual again that says that, hey, I am part of you and part of my community, is something that is unimaginable to someone who has not had that taken away. And I think second, I want to give a shout out to the FRC for the incredible work that they did in Florida back a few years ago, restoring the right to vote to the hundreds of thousands of people that they did. And I know that they did everything that they could to reach out to every individual. The implementation piece is crucial. Reach out to everyone who not only had the right given to them, but those who maybe believe they had, who had those convictions for those other crimes and had not, because those are the people that DeSantis focused on. But FRC suffers from everything that we all do, lack of resources. What we need to do across the country is organizations that have resources, that are led by formerly incarcerated people or have formerly incarcerated people in positions of leadership, is find a way to support FRC in those efforts and support people in Virginia, right? Back when, I forget the name of the governor, I want to say it was Wilder, but I'm not sure, gave the right to vote to all those folks there, the folks in California. How are we pooling our resources to reach out and create the infrastructure with attorneys? LatinoJustice is mostly attorneys, and we have for long wanted to step up to the plate and say, how can we have attorneys in Washington and in Oregon and in Florida and in California, right, give legal counsel to the organizers that are trying to implement these changes, right? And to give counsel to say some sort of hotline to people that says, they call and say, hey, I was convicted in this state, I live in this state for this crime, can I vote? Because that sort of information is crucial, but gathering that and giving it to folks takes an enormous amount of resources. And we need to be willing to step up to the plate and support each other, not just on a state level, but on a national level, I think.
Thank you so much, Jorge. And I'll just add in, there is an effort to expand election protection targeted to justice impacted voters. And so there had been some development of that infrastructure this election cycle, although it didn't get to the place where it needed to be. But there is a commitment from folks engaging and supporting the election protection infrastructure to continue to build that for future election cycles. Leigh, let's go to you in terms of any comments or suggestions you have in terms of implementation once rights have been gained.
Absolutely. Like Jorge said, the implementation piece is going to be crucial. A lot of folks know that if you're, I know in Pennsylvania, I think in most states, correct me if I'm wrong, but that if you're serving pretrial in county jail, if you're doing misdemeanor time, you can vote, right? You can, in Pennsylvania, you can do an absentee ballot, or you can do a voter registration if you're going to be home on election day. In 2020, only 52 people requested a mail-in ballot out of 25,000 people that are currently serving county jail time, right? And so, part of the reason for that is because the processes and procedures here in Pennsylvania in a lot of counties just don't exist. I think that 71% of counties don't have a process or procedure to facilitate voting in jail. When you say process and procedures, in some county jails, if a person asks if they can vote because they know that they're eligible, they don't, the staff won't know how to, facilitate that request. And so then you have county jails that do have processes and procedures, right? But that They just don't implement them. They don't do them, right? So summing it up, I think that the implementation piece is very, very important. Here in Pennsylvania, we're working on a county by county strategy to implement the code. First of all, codify the process, right? But then to implement processes and procedures in the county jails so that folks can do it seamlessly. And part of that in Pennsylvania might mean drop boxes in every county jail, because in 2020, we passed Act 77, which created no excuse absentee ballot. So anybody can request an absentee ballot no matter what. So having a drop box in every county jail would overnight probably increase the voting population, the voting block in county jails. So as we move toward implementing that on the state level and federal level, I think it's incumbent upon us to make sure that as we implement these these state level bills, these county level ordinances, et cetera, right, that we make sure that that we don't just give back the franchise, but that we hold these jails and these facilities accountable for implementing the processes, having clear visitation processes for people to come in and do voter registration and talk about why it's important. Talk about the roles that we're electing, right? Talk about the candidates. You know, we're not telling you who to vote for, but we want to at least educate you on who's going to be on the ballot, educating folks on ballot measures, right? You know, educating people on folks on the track record of the folks that are on the ballot, right? And so all of these things are going to increase turnout and increase the demand for the franchise to be expanded. And I think continuing to create the demand, I think we can't underestimate that, because those of us on the outside can continue to fight for it, but we have to continue to push for our currently incarcerated brothers and sisters to take advantage of the franchise as well and to continue to demand it.
Thank you so much, Leigh. So I'm going to go to Stephanie and Neil, and then I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to go to the questions in the Q&A. So folks, please input your questions in the Q&A. And Chris, I want to bring you in as well if you have any additional context to share. Leigh, thanks for your comments. I think one other best practice around implementation was polling locations in certain correctional facilities, and there's been a growing trend around that. And one of the great outcomes of this last of the primary election cycle was in Cook County. More people, there was actually a higher turnout rate in the Cook County jail than in the general population during the Illinois primary. So that's one great data point. And one of the goals that can intersect conversations around jail-based voting, but then also expanding the franchise overall, is what are the best practices around voting for people in criminal custody and also people in the community. And as we start to document that and build that infrastructure, those are points that we can continue to move on together. So for Stephanie and Neil, I'm going to go to you all because you all are leading in states that had recent ballot measures in the last several years. And so obviously you all are right in the thick of it in terms of this election cycle and future election cycles around this implementation question. So I'm going to go to you first, Stephanie, and then round it out with you, Neil, and then Chris wanted to bring you in if you had any additional context to share. So Stephanie.
Yeah, thank you, Nicole. And for those of you on the call, some of you may have kind of, heard us mention about the ballot that got passed in California, but it was Proposition 17, which allowed for people that are on parole now to have the right to vote. So one of the challenges, and this just passed in 2020. So one of the challenges that we're seeing though are there's just all the misinformation that's still out there. So many people that are coming home on parole still don't think that they have the right to vote. This year, we had came across some voter registration forms, some outdated forms that still had that on there, basically saying that if you are currently serving a sentence on, state or felony parole, you are ineligible to vote. So really trying to, contact all of our registered voters offices here in California to make sure that they have the updated forms so people aren't getting that misinformation. It's something that we're really working on, connecting with a lot of the parole offices to ensure that all of their clients know that they now are eligible to vote, and doing a lot of in-reach, connecting with them to ensure that we are registering their clients to vote. We also do a lot of in-reach in the jails, making sure that we catch them before they even come home, and that we are able to register the ones that are able to vote prior to them even being released. So that is something that we are aggressively working on. We know this year a lot of people weren't able to participate in this election because of that, just not really knowing that they now have the right.
Very important to remember and to figure out steps to take and resources, to Jorge's earlier comment, that need to be directed in order to let people know and then develop the infrastructure necessary to guarantee ballot access. Neil, I want to go to you in terms of implementation.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I'll back up what Stephanie was saying about implementation. I mean, I think implementation cannot be overvalued. Like in 2018, I know here in Florida, right, we ended a 150-year-old Jim Crow law and ended the lifetime ban on felony conviction for 1.4 million people. And at the same time, it just being totally candid, and I love being in a community. Those of us who have been through some stuff, we're not afraid to talk about our mistakes. They actually help us learn. I think one of the biggest mistakes that us as leaders of this movement in Florida and the coalition partners had in Florida is we didn't focus on implementation at all. We focused about getting everything, the petitions on the ballot, trying to fund that thing, trying to build support, trying to, get the language right and get it passed and get 60%, all those things that we needed to do and that we did get done. But ultimately our coalition did not have a game plan and a shared vision for implementation. We didn't think there needed to be implementation, right? And so here in my life experience was on January 8th, 2019, Amendment 4 was written into the Constitution of Florida. I, along with people in all 67 counties, went down and registered to vote. Next day, I don't even know how the guy got it. I got a call from the Senate president saying they wanted to talk to us about implementation. And I look back on it, I'm like, uh-oh, right? Because our coalition actually had not fully thought through implementation. And if we want to do things better tomorrow than today, which is what we want to do, I got to share that piece of it from our perspective. Implementation is wildly important. We saw dozens of people in the state of Florida get arrested for voting in Florida, all of them, like myself and others on this call, people with past convictions. And it was a result of an utterly confusing, broken system that hasn't been fixed in the 4 years since the passage of Amendment 4. And I want to at least own my own personal responsibility to that if everybody who could have had a system that actually works simply as well as a system that would allow, like the example I use is that if I go try to find out whether I can get food stamps or SNAP benefits, the government tells me relatively quickly whether I'm eligible. Y'all know what I'm saying, right? But here in Florida, 4 years later, you still can't be told yes or no on the front end of the voter registration process, whether you're eligible or not, right? And then that leads to the doubling down, which is what we saw in recent months, of the response to that broken system is to arrest people. And even though every single person who had gotten arrested actually got a voter ID card from the same state who was arresting them, right? So the idea that that implementation is a side topic, totally wrong in my experience. We have to think through every step of implementation the minute we start talking about changing policy.
Thank you so much. And Chris, did you have anything you wanted to add there?
Yeah, very briefly, I do think I want to reaffirm what people are saying and amplify it. And Neil's point about implementation is really well taken. Also about the forms not changing. This occurred in Colorado. These forms stick around for forever. So it's a difference between the law in the books and the law in action. And a lot of the short-term strategies that folks have mentioned, and particularly around jails, around having more legal support in different states, I think to parse the more difficult questions is super important. I just wanted to briefly mention one other thing that, our general reentry and community reintegration efforts are also super important here in the longer term. And that is that we know people are more likely to vote when they have stable housing. They're more likely to vote as they have more education. This predicts, and this is just part of the whole humanizing issue that everybody has talked about in one way or another, that people with records will vote for the same reason other people will vote, and we'll be able to predict that and improve that by improving the support services more generally.
Incredibly important. And, we talk about voting as a part of a range of pro-social factors that, can impact people's future, contact with the criminal legal system, and why it's important to, it's important as a part of a reentry and a going home strategy. So thank you so much for lifting that up. So my last question to you all, and Jorge, you had raised your hand. Is there something else you wanted to say?
Yeah, I do want to have my hats off to Neil for saying what he said. That happened to me in Texas when we did a video visitation thing, and we totally messed that up. But I think it that points out the crucial nature of the FIP community stepping up and doing some sort of ad hoc coalition, whatever, just on this or whatever. Because in some states we're like saying, oh, it's up to the state to let us know. We cannot depend on the same system that's complicit in our incarceration to be the agency responsible for saying, oh, look at you, you can vote, you can't vote. We've seen what a lot of these officials are doing. Okay, so again, Neil, thank you for that comment. And brother, we're here to help, man, however we can in any state across the country. Thank you for that.
I think that this is part of the work that's been driving this conversation for so many years. The support and the development of a political infrastructure, right? Guided and led by people directly impacted by the criminal legal system. Some of the folks that I've taken a great deal of inspiration from lost their voting rights and worked on campaigns while they could not vote and actually restored themselves their own rights. So who's not on this call is a guy out of Connecticut, James Jetter, who did that. Same year that California passed its ballot measure, the Connecticut Assembly advanced a law that expanded voting rights to people on parole. James anchored that conversation and restored his own voting rights by supporting and leading that campaign. And so that is what my last question is. There is a movement behind this, despite the two issues driving this conversation now, including one around the criminalization of voting that might chill voter participation. Those officials in Florida, Tennessee, and Texas don't know about y'all, or that they do know, they would like to dismiss y'all. They don't know about James. They don't know about the folks in Louisiana, or they like to not remember them when it's convenient. So I want to ask about the movement going forward and what y'all's insights into what's next for 2023 and beyond around expanding voting rights and then guaranteeing ballot access. So we'll start with you, Leigh, and then go around, and then we'll open it up to questions on the other side of that to folks in the audience. So Leigh?
Absolutely. Yeah. In Pennsylvania, we want to keep chipping away at these counties that don't have policies, and we want to insert policies in these county jails and hold them accountable to, make sure that those policies are being followed. But aside from that, we want to continue to push through the Pennsylvania State Legislature, fingers crossed on us obtaining a majority in the House and Senate, and obtaining the trifecta here in PA. I'll pray for us. But yeah, I mean, if that happens, I think we'll have a friendly legislature, whereas we can really have serious conversations about legislation that are going to expand the franchise to folks that are incarcerated in state prisons. And with that comes the implementation piece. So continuing to lean on the formerly incarcerated community here in Pennsylvania and across the country. And lastly, working with folks outside of Pennsylvania, particularly states that haven't reached the level of progress that they would like, and don't have friendly governors and friendly state houses to work on strategies to implement those processes and procedures in other states as well. So if folks want to get in touch, I'm happy to have conversations with folks out of state.
Great. And people are dropping emails in the chat and are clapping everybody up. So Neil, what about the movement? What's next?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, when I think about the movement, I think about the last couple of years in relation to the years before that, where I think that we've really gotten some pushback in recent years, and it's really important for us to remind ourselves about the bigger picture, about why we do what we do, why it matters. The people and the lives changed that really are the true north of this movement, and that we need to be there for each other. Sometimes you got to borrow somebody else's energy to to get through certain seasons. And I think that keeping the human element that undergirds this movement at the front of our minds is really important in this moment, because we have been making progress. And it's work, right? We got to get up every day and put our work boots on and keep fighting, or we're going to backslide, right? History shows us that's how this works. And so as this movement continues to pick up speed and develops more infrastructure, and you know, I think there really is the desire, from my perspective, that we all kind of understand that this is the long-term game here. And we saw it in Florida. I got to tell you, to get folks arrested, to see that kind of chilling impact that and the fear combined with the confusion that can lead to conversations you don't want to have in your communities. To be totally honest with you, we wanted to be running, you know, GOTV campaigns talking about second chance employment and fair housing, and really empowering our folks to help change things that don't just help us, but help all of society. And instead, you found yourself having conversations with people like, look, man, if you got to sit this one out because you're just not really sure whether you're eligible or not, go back and do what we did 5 years ago when none of us could vote. Go find 5 of your friends, go find your neighbors, go get folks to turn out. But man, I'm for you as a human being. I'm not here just because of your vote. I'm not here just because of what you can do for some organization or something else. Like we're in it for the long haul with you. And so it was like kind of reignited in us the idea that, hey, we're all in this together and we got to keep fighting until the full promise is met. And that the idea that nobody should be losing their rights from the get-go, you know, should be possible and should be something that we're looking for even as we fight right here, right now, not to lose any steam in the movement.
Thank you so much. And Jorge, I'm going to go to you. You've kind of hinted at it in your comments already, but any other thoughts about what might be next?
Yeah, just a quick thing. I think a deeper alignment with the immigration justice folks, who we talk about that time. Sometimes we talk about the intersections, but we don't really see that a lot of the issues they face are the same ones we do, and they need to see that also. I think we made grounds for that, and I think the movement will take a more humanistic turn. I think there's a lot of states across the country that have association laws, by which I mean I can't hang out with someone who is I'm on parole, and I can't hang out with someone who's on parole. Massachusetts, for example, will lock you up in a heartbeat for that. We will start chipping away at laws that depend on the inherent otherness of someone who's committed a certain crime. We will focus on the carve-outs a lot more and find ways to attack that. And once we start being successful in humanizing everyone, right, then I think the easier things will fall into place. And
Stephanie, you had the first comment, and then we're going to round you out with the last one before we go to the audience Q&A. What's your next steps or your ideas for the movement?
So when thinking about, you know, the future and thinking about the movement, like I have to acknowledge the groups that, you know, we are, many of us are already a part of, which is groups like All of Us or None, or FICPFM, you know, formerly incarcerated convicted people and family movement. It's a national base, you know, like it's important that we continue to come together nationally and strategize and think of ways that we can collectively come together. I know we just came back from Atlanta last month. And we went out there to advocate to free the vote in Georgia. So it really takes us all coming together throughout the United States, from wherever we are, to try and ensure that we are restoring voting rights for everybody. I know with the states that just took involuntary servitude out their constitution, that was something that we tried to do here in California this year that didn't pass. So of course, for us, that is like our focus next year, really working to ensure that we get that out of our state constitution. And being that these other 4 states did it, I think the momentum is there. So really, you know, taking advantage of that right now and thinking of ways that we can continue to make that a national.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So let's go to these questions in the Q&A. Morgan, do you have any? I'm going to ask my colleague Morgan with the Sentencing Project if she has any guidance on some of the questions to pick. And Morgan, did you have
it? Someone asked, sorry, let me look back. Someone asked from Minnesota. This was actually in the chat. I live in Minnesota, where we now have a Democratic legislature and governor, and the opportunity to advance restore the vote in 2023. What advice would you have based on recent wins on the issue in other states?
let me jump in and say, so this is nonpartisan advocacy work. And I think this is the heart of what needs to happen going next in this country, which is building democracy, expanding democracy as opposed to suppressing it. But that's not about any political party. But with that, and with the flip in the Minnesota State House, what thoughts do people have? Chris, you're from Minnesota, raised there. What thoughts do you have?
That's right. Yeah, I was involved in the ACLU challenge to disenfranchisement and have prepared an expert report on that. If folks would be interested in that with lots of statistics and legal history. I would say that in the past, it's run up against, I was asked when testifying on an earlier bill that whether I was in favor of extending the vote to people convicted of treason and terrorism and all of the scare tactics that started whittling away at whatever the coalition. And so I would say at the time, the party that was advancing this bill got a little scared of that, and they were afraid of being tarred with the stigma of crime. I'd like to think that the situation has changed, and that I think it is a friendlier environment. I think the Secretary of State is friendly to this argument, and the state attorney. So I do feel like there's definitely a chance to really move Minnesota in the right direction.
Absolutely. I reached out to some colleagues in Minnesota. So whoever that is, I'm going to find you and reach out to you because I'm excited about what could be next in Minnesota. So thanks for lifting that up. Any other questions, Morgan, to get to before we wrap up?
That was Liz Doyle who asked that question. So
Hey, Liz, I'll be contacting
you. This is from Rachel Cook. Do you feel allowing more incarcerated communities to vote would also benefit their rehabilitation with the thought of making them feel a sense of belonging?
I guess I will just jump in on that. I definitely do. I spent 10 years in and out the criminal justice system. And I remember once I got connected to groups like All of Us Are Done and A New Way of Life, and they really showed me how to use my voice and how, my vote really made a difference. Certain measures like Proposition 17 only passed because people showed up and voted. That would not have passed had people not really turned out. So when you give people a chance to be a part of actually creating change and creating laws in their community, it just increases the chances of them being able to stay out.
Yeah, I'd affirm that based on some work I've done in Minnesota and elsewhere, that once you start voting, you're extremely unlikely to get into subsequent trouble. I just use the caveat that some of the people who are being prosecuted for illegal voting are actually the ones who are doing better in the community. They're actually expressing that community interest and connection. And so we have to be vigilant on that as well.
Yeah, and I think that question kind of touches on the deeper work that I know all of us are also engaged in, which involves kind of how we see each other, how we see ourselves in society. And to be able to manifest that through the voting process, like speaks in volumes that, all the policy papers and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but I'm saying, like, to be human with each other is really what can drive this movement. I remember when I was talking to Desmond, this was like 2 years after I met him, 2015. I came from a background of politics, right? So like I literally asked him, I'm like, man, I'm confused, dude. Like, who's our enemy in this, right? Like, I'm trying to orient a political campaign the way I was raised to run a political campaign. He's like, Neil, sometimes you got that good ideas. That one's wrong. He's like, that's not what this is about at all. He's like, something deeper is going on here, and that is that if people see us as human beings, Amendment 4 is going to pass. If they see us as less than that, then it's not. And at the core of our work is actually that fight. It was so awesome to be taught that lesson because it reoriented how I see this movement work. And I think that question touched on this. And I know everyone on this conversation sees that as a part of the longer term solution for really empowering people who have been impacted by the system in our society.
We think really briefly, from my perspective, I think that not only is it something that is going to make folks feel empowered in their lives, I think it's imperative that as people that are trying to encourage, in some cases, formally encouraging incarcerated people to vote, I think it's imperative to frame it in a way that really shows what the evidence shows, right? Which is that when you're involved in the electoral process through voting, it doesn't stop there. As a formerly incarcerated person, didn't stop there for me. It wasn't like, okay, I'm gonna vote and that's it. No, it literally became a way of life for me. Democracy and advocacy is all connected. So you can't have one without the other. So framing it in that way says to them, yeah, I'm empowered, right? But not just because I'm voting for some dude or some woman that says they're gonna do something for me and not do it, but I'm empowered because I see that there are more people like me that collectively we have that kind of power that can shift the electorate and shift the leadership in all of our states.
It is a question about what politicizes people. And then once people are politicized, how to continue to support their full participation in the franchise and in community. And so that's what, that's an opportunity that's coming out of many of these conversations. Any other questions to get to? Morgan, I think we have time for one more question.
This is a positive one to end on, but Savvy says, how can we all come together from across the nation to build a model for voter restoration? We need all the help we can get here in Kentucky.
I know they do. And I don't mean to say that laughingly, because it's a very serious thing. And there's been a very long journey in Kentucky that's continuing to do that. So Neil, let's start with you. What do you have? What suggestions do you have for our fellow Kentuckians?
Yeah, well, when I grew up right across the river, so I feel like I've spent a lot of time in Kentucky, and I think there's people with learned experience who can help drive the change that needs to happen in Kentucky, and to lean into their experience, their expertise. I think sometimes when it's your life that we're talking about, you're willing to kind of put in that extra energy, kind of listen a little bit more, make sure that you got the right strategies. I remember some of what the strategies that came our way in Florida from people who cared and just didn't know, right? Like Desmond and I, every once in a while, we're like, man, they almost want us to go just talk to the suburbs, which that's a part of the strategy. But we're like, man, we're going to trailer parks in the hood, right? Like we're going to where our folks live so that we can build this thing for the long term. So no disrespect to where other people are coming from, we're better together. But I think in Kentucky, there's some great leaders who've been through something, and let them use those life experiences to help drive that change.
Thank you. Any other comments from folks as we wrap up, as we get to wrapping up point?
I think joining in national coalitions is going to be really important. I think the left hand knowing what the right hand is doing is going to be really important, so we don't reinvent the wheel. Obviously, like folks are saying, we are stronger together. So I think that if we can all find a way to share what each state is doing and to have regular conversations, and again, to share connections, to share, whatever resources that we have, I think we can see some real strong successes over the next couple of years. So I think Kentucky, holler at us, let's work together.
And there is some great work in Kentucky with Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, led by many fantastic directly impacted organizers, including a woman who's been doing this work for many years, Tanya Vogel, in Kentucky. So great work. And then a currently elected official, formerly incarcerated elected official, Keturah Huron. I hope I'm saying their name correctly. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Thank you for sharing your analysis and your perspective. Just want to wrap up by putting a fine point on this, that there is a movement that the Sentencing Project is going to be participating in with our fantastic panelists, with Neil from the Florida Rights Coalition, with Stephanie, the All of Us or None organizer, with a new reentry project, new way of life reentry project in California, with Jorge, the national director at LatinoJustice, but doing work in Texas and across the country. And of course, with Leigh, who is bridging the strategy around jail-based voting to ending felony disenfranchisement and guaranteeing voting rights for all to folks in prison, regardless of their crime of conviction. And with Chris and your research partners, we are going to continue to look into this issue, to document the impact of current felony disenfranchising laws. But this work is not done because the electoral cycle is over. On November 9th, I was just as busy as I was before, and I will continue to be that busy for years to come, because there's a lot of work to do. There are too many people who continue to be denied the vote. And this work is going to continue in supporting expanding voting rights and guaranteeing voting rights for everyone. Once people get their rights, they should never lose them, even if they come in contact with the criminal legal system. So we're going to wrap up here, but this is not the end. To the point of a national conversation, be in touch with the Sentencing Project. We're going to continue to organize regular meetings, regular strategy discussions, and want people in the audience and around the country to join us in those discussions. So feel free to reach out to me directly around that. And then we're going to continue this work going forward. So thank y'all. And thank you to those who joined us, and we'll be in touch.